what alchemy truly is, at least this is how I understand it, and people might disagree with me, it's not to negate any of the truths of science as we understand it. It's about trying to reconcile the objective material world of science with a potential subjective world of value.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's what the alchemists, from what I understand, and I tend to be quite influenced, as you say, by Carl Jung in my perspective, that's what the alchemists are trying to do. As somebody who studies alchemy, I try to determine whether or not that subjective world exists, whether it can be mapped out, whether it can enhance a person's life whatsoever. And by recommending those books, as well as the works of Carl Jung in that video, I left it for people to discover that truth for themselves.
Welcome back to the transmission, my friends. It is so lovely to be back with you. I'm going to make a prediction today that I know just by virtue of the fact that you are watching this, that you feel a sense of psycho-spiritual longing, that existential angst, that wriggle that you just can't put your finger on, that no matter what job you get, what obligations you have, what relationships you're in, that feeling persists. That nebulous feeling that's hard to put your finger on just sticks around over the course of your life and even tends to develop, get more pronounced as you age. And two, another prediction really, you're not sure what to do about it. You've encountered a lot of different modalities on how you can approach that sense of mental dis-ease, but you haven't really found the thing. In fact, you're not really sure how to even characterize it. Is it a pathology? Is it just part of being alive? There are so many different ways to think about it for sure, and that's one of the things that makes it so frustrating. But one of my favorite ways to think about it is that this feeling is there for a reason, and that reason is that it is a unconscious reminder. It's a signal from the deeper parts of our psyche that we're not meant to simply fit into a box. We're not meant to identify ourselves in the context of any of those things I mentioned above, our jobs, our relationships. There's something more. There's something unique at the very root of your being that's calling you toward it. And that requires that we continue exploring. That if we want to find out who we are, we have to prioritize our own coming into being so that we can be the fullest, the most complete version of ourselves, as Jung called it. And he called this process of becoming individuation. As I said, this lifelong process of becoming, of trying to contextualize the psyche, make the unconscious conscious so that we can be more whole. And one of his favorite archetypes to symbolize this process, as I'm sure some of you know, was alchemy. This process of changing prima materia, a base material, to something sacred, something sublimated. And I'm tempted to ramble further about why that is, but we will inevitably bleed into territory that is covered in this mind meld with my friend Max Derrat, because he is a creator who has explored this very concept vigorously for years on his YouTube channel, which I'm sure many of you already subscribe to, but if you don't, do it. And while we're on this topic, Max is a anonymous, faceless creator, hence why he will be portrayed by a yellow avatar in this episode. Yellow is kind of his thing. And as I mentioned, he extensively explores topics like this, alchemy, Jung, and other esoteric fare, particularly in the context of video games and media on his lovely YouTube channel. And we do just that kind of exploration throughout this conversation. I hope you enjoy it. I greatly did. On that note, you're going to find everything you need for Max Derrat in the description. Same for Third Eye Drops. On that note, my friends, do presently stop, tickle, feed, satisfy the algorithm with a like, a sub, a comment, a share. It is vitally important for the growth of this media vessel. And did you know we've got over 300 audio-only podcasts? I've been doing this for years, but you can only hear that back catalog wherever you listen to podcasts. So Apple Pod, Spotify, do subscribe over there. You're going to find something you're interested in. We've got so many brilliant folks in those mind melds. And I would love for you, my friends, to initiate yourselves a layer deeper into the community by joining us over at patreon.com/third eye drops, where you can actually participate. You can have conversations like this with me and hundreds of other Wonder Dippers on Zoom. Every month we do what I call a Wonder Gym hang, where we riff pretty open-endedly on topics just like this, and we often feature a guest in those conversations that you've heard on the show. Maybe someday we'll be able to get Max Derrat to join us live. If that sounds good to you, join us at patreon.com/third eye drops. We've also got a patron-only Discord, a book club. You get rewards like stickers, pins, shirts, and more. All of it only for patrons. So much love to all of you already supporting, by the way. And on that note, my friends, let's meld minds with Max Derrat. Max, it is lovely to have you back in the Mind Meld. Ever since your first appearance, I've been getting the regular question, when will he be back? When will he be back?
Oh, really?
And the time is now. The time is now, whenever now is in terms of publishing. But welcome back, man.
Hey, it's good to be here. Good to see you again.
One of the things we initially bonded over and thought, yeah, we're definitely going to do an in-depth mind meld that orbits around the mystery that we call alchemy. And we hardly did. Like, we did a very oblique sort of talking around it and in the milieu of alchemical, hermetic language, but we never went deep into what it is, why it's an archetype and a practice that matters, why it's relevant, what it really means. And I know this is something that you hover around a lot on your channel from multiple angles for people who haven't watched your videos. Like, you have videos directly about alchemy, you have videos about alchemical symbolism in media, you look at it from a Jungian psycho-spiritual standpoint a lot, which is something that I'm also hugely interested in. So let's actually start there. And I think maybe a good way to do that is to sort of summarize the video you put out recently on, is it How to Be an Alchemist? Is that what you titled it?
Yes, that's what it was called, yeah.
And I didn't know you shouted me out in that until earlier today, so thanks for that, man. I appreciate it.
Hey, no problem. So people have been requesting a video for a while because, as you said, I have done a lot of videos either directly talking about alchemy or tangentially referencing it, primarily in video games, but sometimes in other forms of media. People have been wondering whether I could put together a video on how to properly get into alchemy, either as somebody who wants to practice it or somebody who wants to study it. So I created a video that caters to both of those groups of people. And what did I do? I gave them a list of tutorial books to start with. Some of the ones that I suggested were people that are adherents, I guess, more or less, of the alchemical doctrine, people like Titus Burckhardt, which I recommended regardless of his personal faith, because I think it's just a good text and an accurate text about what alchemy is all about. And then I recommended the works of Mircea Eliade, who's probably one of the greatest religious scholars that ever lived, a book called The Forge and the Crucible, which teaches you how to think like an alchemist and how to project value onto the material world. And then alongside that, I also tried to get into whether there was any value in researching alchemy in the modern day, post-enlightenment, post-science, post-theory of evolution. And I acknowledged, all the contradictions that are there between alchemy, as a lot of people understood it in science. But I also tried to point out that what alchemy truly is, at least this is how I understand it, and people might disagree with me, but this is just how I understand it. It's not to negate any of the truths of science as we understand it. It's about trying to reconcile the objective material world of science with a potential subjective world of value.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's what the alchemists, from what I understand, and I tend to be quite influenced, as you say, by Carl Jung and my perspective, that's what the alchemists are trying to do. And so, as somebody who studies alchemy, I try to determine whether or not, as I'm sure you can clearly sympathize with this, whether or not that subjective world exists, whether it can be mapped out, whether it can enhance a person's life whatsoever. And by
Yeah.
recommending those books as well as the works of Carl Jung in that video, I left it for people to discover that truth for themselves. Themselves. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Man, that really is the question of all questions that you just posed right there.
Yeah.
This whether or not this subjective world of symbols, the unconscious, collective unconscious, exists in a substantive way that really matters outside the purview of it being just some kind of weird, epiphenomenal exhaust off of our brains or something.
Mm-hmm.
Like, does it really exist in an archetypal way, in a collective unconscious sort of way, as Jung would have characterized it? And if so, what does that mean? What is the imperative for the individual in terms of why does it matter? Like, how do we understand it? How do we bridge those worlds? Because one of the things you're going to find, like I was just saying to you before we recorded, is if you do interface with this world in the form of reading primary writings by alchemists, particularly, alchemists from antiquity, like one of the ones I'm the yeah, Paracelsus. Yep. And one of the ones I've been super, super fascinated with is Zosimus. Zosimus of
Panopolis.
Man, just I was watching a video just before this that is like I don't recall the exact text that it's from, but when you go into that realm and you read about just this symbolic, it's unclear some of the times what he's talking about. Like, some of the times he's specifically saying that it's a dream or a vision, and it's like he's dipping right in and out of doing the actual outer exoteric work that he's doing alchemically and going back into the visionary realm of dreams. And it's like this psycho-spiritual, just like you were alluding to before, this weird discipline that spans both the psychical world and the physical world. And it's like these people seem to be very adept at crossing that bridge.
Mm-hmm. Jung did that too,
Very much so. Very much so. But when you go into that realm, just before I forget to finish this thought, you're going to realize that you're now in some kind of territory that, while it is constructed of symbols that you have seen in your life, most likely, it's not a realm that we are fluent in. It's like you see a, like maybe you look at a Ripley scroll or some piece of alchemical art, and you see a king with a sword and a sun and a moon and a maiden, and all these things. And it's like, yeah, I know what those are, but they're representing they're representing something behind the image, and our ability to grasp those images is just not something most people have these days. And when you go to those places, your mind starts to just feel straight up altered. Like I feel high when I'm reading this stuff sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. When I read the works of, I was greatly helped by people like Eliade and Jung and Burckhardt when it came to trying to interpret alchemical works. And when I'm reading them and the actual, not ancient, but the old texts by people like Dorn, by Paracelsus, by Zosimos, you can feel, and you were just alluding to this when we were briefly talking before the call, you can feel your brain actually react in a tangible way. The best way that I can describe it, and I've described this to other people, it's like somebody sticking their fist inside my brain and then slowly unclenching that fist, and all your brain matter is moving around. That's what it feels like.
Yeah, it does, and it feels. You know how if you Yeah,
not painfully. It's
right.
not
Yeah,
painful. It's
yeah.
just yeah.
Yeah, it's like
Yeah.
it's like an unfolding begins to occur.
Hmm.
It's almost like, to me, like if you're able to maintain a level of awareness as you're falling asleep and you go into the hypnagogic space and dreams sort of start slowly manifesting and you start to see images appearing that you somehow innately understand this is tied in to something that I'm experiencing or dealing with, but there's no like math equation I can do that's going to make this make sense. But I just know. I know that this, like, for instance, the other night, I had a dream of this, like, it's just this very sorry, disgusting, dirty, slithering man. I guess it was like this just dirty, you know, figure who was very off putting, very gross in every
Yeah.
way. And your initial reaction is to just like recoil at this, right?
Hmm.
But if you've been reading Jung and you've been thinking about the things going on in your life, you've been thinking about things you're avoiding, things and other people that turn you off or put you off, you start to do this work of, ah, that's communicating with me now.
Yeah.
And then some people might be like, wait, what's communicating with you? The manifestation of all of those things, and you could think of this as the shadow probably, is coming to you in a way where it's there for you to communicate with and attempt to bring into your conscious life in a way where you can't do that in waking life. So we think that it's not possible. But then in these other weird realms of symbolism and archetype and alchemy, as we're alluding to, that's a huge part of the art. Like
Yeah.
that's an important central part of the art somehow.
To put a bow on your point, I'm pretty sure you're familiar with this alchemical phrase, "in sterquilinis invenitur." You know what that means?
Off the top of my head, I don't.
Okay, so it's I can't remember who said it, and I can't remember where I read it, but it's Latin, and it translates directly as "in filth it will be found,"
Mm.
which
Mm.
essentially the meaning of that means the thing that you most require, the thing that you most need, will be found in the place that you least want to look.
Ooh. Heavy Jungian overtones with that too, in terms of the shadow,
Yep.
and also just the hero's journey of like, the treasure you seek is, it's always like right in the nastiest, deepest dark of the dragon's pit.
There you
It's like
go.
that place you don't that you just don't want to go.
Mhm.
But
And
so
the, yeah.
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
And no, and the I was just gonna say, and the alchemists, if there's any validity to their theory, then they understood it intuitively. That's all.
Yeah. Yeah, and that actually dovetails into the question I was going to ask you because,
Yeah.
if there is any validity to the theory. But I don't know if we've said this yet. Maybe you did when you were talking about the video. But so what is their theory? What is their point, do you think? And why does it matter to us now?
Hmm. So people, I must stress this. My perspective on alchemy is influenced greatly by Jung, and there are a lot of alchemists that don't like Jung. There
Yeah.
are a lot of people that think that his perspective contaminates a lot of other people's views, and I have some sympathy for that because I've spoken to other people about hermetic traditions like magic and the occult and all that, they always say, "Look, I don't want my views to bias yours because that might hinder your personal spiritual journey,"
Mm-hmm.
and I get that, but just to describe what the underlying project is, I think that there is some utility in this and won't mess up anybody who's listening, your personal journey. So, the way that I understand it is that what the alchemists were trying to do is they were trying to use the material world around them to symbolize stuff that was happening within. And they were trying to use the material world to map ways to transcend their current mortal state and achieve higher degrees of inner enlightenment, as well as, in theory, uh, emphasize in theory, physical transformation. So, one thing that I've often pointed out, and I think I might have pointed this out in the video we were my video that we were just talking about, is that one way that the alchemists tried to describe divinity, trying to use just things that we see in everyday life, is by the merging of opposites, so into something paradoxical. So the sun and the moon, male and female, chaos and order, they would personify this in the form of the rebus, which was a
Yeah.
personification of the philosopher's stone.
Squaring the circle too, right?
Squaring the circle, yep, that's another symbol that Jung used to describe his process of bringing unconscious contents into consciousness. And the alchemists are trying to use stuff like that, squaring the circle, all that, to try and describe these inner psychological processes so that you can make this transformation. Now, that's just my perspective. I highly encourage anybody else that's really interested in alchemy to have other opposing views challenge mine, and then come to your own conclusions. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hopefully
Well,
that
it does.
wasn't too
Yeah.
confusing there.
It does, and I think the thing is, from my perspective, is whether you're really coming at this from the Jungian model and using that language, or you're coming at it from a more pure hermetic Western esoteric tradition.
Sure.
I personally think they harmonize, but I think the problem is when people try to reduce it to it's only this or it's only that. Like it's only psychospiritual, or no, it really is this thing where you're trying, like they're really concerned with the outer process of, you know, the cliche one is turning lead to gold, but there's so many other things in terms of like making talismans, making holy statues. Like Zosimus, for instance, he was considered an expert in making sacred Egyptian statues. Like he was an Egyptian priest as well as an alchemist. And do you know about like the opening of the mouth ceremony and all this stuff?
No, please enlighten me.
If you just want to, so this is a perfect example of, if I told you the punchline to this, if I told people the punchline to this, maybe not because they're listeners of this show, but if it's just, you just told a person this on the street, they'd be like, you're a fucking crazy person. But he'll wax poetic in what sounds indistinguishable from like something in Jung's Red Book where he's doing active imagination and interacting with these archetypal characters. He'll go from doing something like that where he's talking about like, oh, and I have to tell you about just a synchronicity that made me scream this morning. But
Okay.
but he'll be talking about stuff like that, like, you know, these visions of maidens and priests and serpents and whatever. And then he'll talk about something that's very, very clearly like an actual metallurgic process that you do. And then he'll talk about like something from the Book of Enoch. And then he'll talk about, so when we're fixing a spirit to the statue in the temple and we do the opening of the mouth ceremony, which is like after the statue figure of the god or whatever it is perfected, it goes into the most holy part of the temple where only priests of a certain level are allowed. And they do this magical, I think the word in Greek is telesterion or something like that. And this is the process. And this is the process where the statue becomes occupied by the spirit of the god or whatever it is that you're drawing down. So he'll talk about all these things within the page, like the span of a few pages, as if they're all like, everyone understands that, yeah, these are things, this is all pretty normal, at least in terms of like late antique Egypt, you know, that he lived in like the Alexandrian age, I believe, like 200, 300, something like that. So it goes to show just how different the worldview is, but at the same time that there's like all of these different ways of thinking that we would consider these things to be disparate. Like you have religion, you have a hard science like metallurgy, you have, you know, chemical things going on, you have what sounds like active imagination or visions going on, you have rituals going on, and they're all combining into this discipline that we look back on and we just like say, oh, that's alchemy. but it's like, how do you, do you say this, I want to keep this part, but that's nonsense. How does one, I mean, I know you don't have the answer to that, but um, yeah, that was my tangent. I don't even remember where it started, but
Well, well, actually, you were making a lovely point about how like you don't see like one perspective as negating one's personal journey. It's just about like Jung's thoughts or Paracelsus's thoughts or Dorn's thoughts or Meyer's thoughts. They're all tools that you can use on your journey. The important thing, and you also said this, is that you don't just say, okay, this is the canonical view.
right. Yeah.
They're all ways of trying to describe an underlying truth. And that truth is something that you try to use these tools to intuit. That's how I understand it. And
Yeah.
I thank you for actually making that clarification. I think that helps.
Yeah. I don't even know what if anything I clarified, but let's bring it back to something that's a little more
Sure, sure.
pointed. I think the underlying archetype is this archetype of transformation, right? Taking something and not only turning it into something else, but imbuing it with some level of sacred value, or sublimating something to the point where the sacred value becomes apparent. So that, the alchemical archetype, generally speaking, is the journey of prima materia, primary material, into what would either be called the
The
rubedo,
gold.
the
Yeah.
gold, the philosopher's stone, whatever. And I think people can appreciate that symbolically, but in that psychospiritual sense, that is what Jung was talking about, and I think also harmonizes with the traditional Hermetic view, depending on how far you're willing to go with it. What do you think that symbolizes in terms of like a person's actual psyche, soul, being? What do you think's going on in that alchemical process, and how would you characterize it?
Well, prima materia, for people who don't know, was essentially an attempt by the alchemists to describe the universe as it was before it came into being. It's a piece of the void. We last time we talked about Full Metal Alchemist, you actually see an example of this in that anime. One of the, well, not one of the main villain of that show is a character named Father, who starts off as something known as the dwarf in the flask, and the dwarf in the flask is literally this piece of like black. It's the rotundum of the alchemists. It's the void, um, and that is a state of pure unconsciousness. It's just pure potential where nothing yet has come into being. So that's where you start, be it as the worlds, as the macrocosm, or you personally as the microcosm. And then it was, there were many attempts by the alchemists to try and describe that process psychologically as well as physically to get from that starting point to the end point of the metaphorical gold or the philosopher's stone. Um, and the steps vary. Some steps, it's as simple as three steps, which are Nigredo, Albedo, and Rubido. Shout out to the Xenosaga fans. Nigredo being the prima materia, and then Albedo being the whitening, the purification of the prima materia to a point where there's no black, it's just pure white. And then that white evolves into a state of red, and the red is associated with the philosopher's stone. That's the end goal. Jung, bring things back to Jung, he believed, and to try and address your original question, he believed that, at least with that three-step process, it was an attempt to bring unconscious contents into consciousness. And so, what is the theoretical endpoint of that process, where you bring all of your inner potential into consciousness? You have no more potential that you have to fulfill. Well, then you're Rubido. Then you're the ideal man. You're the philosopher's stone incarnate. You're not the rebus, but what the rebus represents, right?
Yeah.
But then,
Which
you
again,
know,
that's the merging of, that's like the male and female, usually symbolized as like this single higher being, essentially, that you
all the
Yeah.
Although, just to bring things, hopefully I don't completely throw people off, but I think you might understand this and this will be valuable. One thing that Jung believed you had to do in order to bring unconscious contents into consciousness is not only to confront shadow, there's also this inner archetype that exists within, well, you and I are males, so he believed that within every male there was a female
Hmm.
figure that you had to reconcile with, known as the anima.
Yeah.
For women, that was the animus. And that was this, for women, that was this inner man.
Hmm.
And the idea of contending with this, for you and I, this inner woman, is that we bring into consciousness all the positive feminine values and also reign under our control all the negative feminine values. And of course, there are obviously the inverse positive and negative masculine values. And then when all these things are brought into consciousness, you, psychologically speaking, I suppose, embody the rebus, which is the union of the male and the female, the masculine and feminine, into this paradoxical deity that is the personification of the philosopher's stone.
Yeah.
And then just to put a cap on answering your original question, obviously, the physical process of nigredo, albedo, rubido is not something that can be accomplished. So the alchemists tried to extrapolate that into a variety of different steps. So going from 3 to 4, they add this element of Satrinitas between
Hmm.
albedo
Hmm.
and rubido,
Yeah.
which is akin to sort of like the
Yeah.
opening of the eyes to the
Oh.
gold. Sorry, are you trying to say something?
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, yeah, that's sometimes called the yellowing.
There you go. Yeah,
Yeah.
the
Hmm.
Satrinitas. Yeah. And then there's probably one of the more well-known step processes of the 7-step processes, because those were mapped onto the planets. So starting with
Hmm.
Saturn, which was likened to the lead, which is symbolically the prima materia, all the way up to the sun, which is the end process. And the sun, there's a reason why the sun is associated with the metal gold. It's the alchemist gold.
Yeah.
But then there were 12 and there are 14, and that's the problem. That's the underlying problem. It's trying to
Hmm.
reconcile these inner symbols, these inner psychological processes with the physical world. Can it be done? I don't know.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And this is where the rabbit hole really begins to explode out in a fractal way, because what I've heard, so I just did a podcast recently with this guy MJ Dorian. You would love his podcast if you haven't heard it. It's called
Yeah.
Creative Codex. He does a
Hmm.
lot of Jung stuff. He's also an artist and experiments with a lot of esoteric stuff in his own right. Um, Beautifully soundscaped. It's audio only for the most part, but he is currently doing a series on alchemy and mostly from a Jungian perspective, but he's also looking at certain alchemists and their actual, writings and experiments and stuff like that. And he's doing some experiments himself based off a French esotericist and alchemist whose name I can't remember, but he has he has guides essentially.
Wow.
And
Okay.
he's doing a kind of plant alchemy. I think it's called spagyric alchemy. And it takes you through the step of like, you start with, I think it's like lemon balm, and then you do put it in alembic, you do all this stuff. It does become black, and he got to the point where it became white and everything. And it doesn't, apparently, at least this version of it doesn't take that long, and it's not super difficult to do. It just, it does take some time. You have to leave heat going and stuff like that. But anyway, one of the things that he was talking about that you immediately begin to get this sense of once you start slaving over this process is the psycho-spiritual bridge thing that Jung was very concerned with and would, talk a lot about in terms of synchronicity and not being able to understand this. Like, what is the mechanism between how can my mind entangle with this outer process? That's essentially what you're experiencing when you have a synchronicity, right? Like
Yeah.
you think about something, and then at the same time that thing happens in some kind of spooky way that we can't
Hmm.
mechanistically draw a line to. But what he was saying is that once you start doing this process and you in your mind are trying to nurture the tinder of this process and make sure it's going well and make sure everything's going the right way, you develop this really close bond with this physical object, and you develop this weird unspoken relationship with this object. And then one of the things that he said is interesting is that the esotericist who's like, you know, giving the directions says how long, like when to start a process and when to end a process, and it's often governed by other external natural forces. Yeah. So one of the things is like, you don't remove this until, you know, whatever waxing moon part. I don't remember what it was, but he immediately is like, I don't know shit about moon cycles. So then you have to learn about moon cycles. And you see where I'm going with this, where it's like, you're not just doing something in an alembic, you're doing it in your mind. You're doing it in accordance with nature. You're doing it only when the time is right, symbolically and archetypally and maybe astrologically or whatever. And now all of these things that used to not be related to one another, you're relating them physically and mentally and symbolically through this whole like intertwined process. And the way he put it is that it almost seems like a magnet for synchronicities. Because when he was doing this, people can listen to this. It's like toward the end of the podcast I did with this guy, MJ Dorian. When he was doing this, he there's a whole story about like the raven and the symbolism of the raven and how he has a sort of history with ravens. And when he was doing this process, and I realize you don't know him, so this might sound super woo and super like not believable, but he's not the type of guy to just make this up. In the alembic he was working on, when the material coagulated in a way that looked exactly like a black bird's head inside of his alembic during the Negretto blackening part of the process. So his weird relationship with the symbol of the raven and a raven-like head appearing inside the tube, like that just is a wild synchronicity. But
so the underlying theory that you're getting at is by engaging in this both physical and spiritual process, weird things that can happen that you can't explain. It's something that alchemists tried to discover the legitimacy behind. And to be perfectly honest, like I don't know what to make of that. If anything, I do, as I said right at the very beginning of this podcast, I do try to not negate the truths of science while also trying to not dismiss any of this stuff. But I will say this. What I have found by studying alchemy and doing videos on it is that by going down the spiritual path, the stuff that, like you were just saying, synchronicities that happen to me are off the chain sometimes, like more than they've ever happened in my life. And it's like there's some sort of force that's telling me, no, you got to keep doing this. And I don't know what to make of it, but maybe just to whoever's listening, maybe you can take what Mike said and what I said and draw from that what you will.
Well, the other thing, too, I guess we have to bring up at this point is that a core idea, not just in alchemy, but in Hermeticism in general, is correspondence. And that there's this tiered relationship that if you are initiated into this way of knowing, that you start to learn the language of. Like Paracelsus definitely talked a lot about this, but it's right there in the first line of the Emerald Tablet too. Like that which is above is like that which is below.
Yep.
And the idea being that really everything around you is of one fundamental substance, like one fundamental sacred substance. And if you know how to manipulate that and identify that in terms of like elementally and symbolically, as you were pointing out before, like planets/gods are associated with different metals. So, like you said, lead is Saturn, iron is Mars, Mercury is Mercury, copper is Venus, etc. And again, from our perspective, we're just like, what? But you have to understand that it fits within this language of everything's in this shares this some kind of weird relationship, and it's not just metals. It's like there's flowers, there's gems, there's all of this stuff, and you can still buy correspondence books like that have been around since antiquity, that are just like tables of like this thing corresponds to this thing. Again, is there any empirical reality to this? I have no idea, but it's part of this very deep language of symbolism that goes back thousands of years at least.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know what to make of it, but it's super interesting. And
Yes.
I think that too, and I think that my point is that I think that's another word for synchronicity, is when we see things connecting in a way where we're like, there's no math there that I'm aware of that makes sense. Well, maybe if you were steeped in the language of correspondence, you would have seen the signs of this appearing. And even Jung was definitely aware of this. Like, he talks about, I use this quote, I think, in the last synchronicity video I did, where he talks about essentially the problem with any kind of egotistical wielding of synchronicity, in terms of thinking like it's somehow about you, like like this sequence of events is somehow you in your mind causing this thing, or manifesting this thing. He talks about how that's essentially a slippery slope toward schizophrenia, but that if there really is any underlying law to it, it probably has something to do with what's been called correspondence. That's a paraphrase, but it shows that he was kind of connecting these same dots, it seems like.
Yeah. Well, that's the name of the book that he wrote on synchronicity. The subtitle for it was an acausal connecting principle.
Yeah, exactly.
That's correspondence. Yeah. There you go.
Yeah, 100%. And what's great too is a lot of Jungian analysts, and I think maybe even Jung himself, connected synchronicity and these strange correspondences and the connection between the psycho and physical realm. The what did he call it? The psychoid bridge or whatever is Hermes. And who's the patron god of alchemy? None other than Hermes Mercury.
Well, of course, because he was the messenger of the gods. He went from the heavens down to earth. That's the uniting of the immaterial with the material.
Yeah. And, this is starting to get into also one of the really fun topics that we broached a bit last time, which is, why is it that we are all so obsessed with continuing to perpetuate certain esoteric images, even when we are largely ignorant of the context, the efficaciousness, if there even is any? Like, we were talking about some famous examples last time, and there's debate in this series, were they aware of what they were doing? I think one series we were talking about was Evangelion. And your argument was like, yeah, they're 100% aware of what they're doing.
Yes.
And, but I have to think that in some cases people aren't. And
sure,
that in and of itself is very interesting and implies something really interesting, I think, which I've been rambling too long, so I don't want to launch into that. But I do want to revisit that question of why it is that people continue to perpetuate these images and seed these images, because we joked around like maybe there's the invisible college, or a hidden esoteric hand, dropping hints or something for people who are ready to go deeper. And that's the sort of fun conspiracy theory version of it. But I think there's some other angles too, and I'm curious what your answer to that is in general.
So I have a lot of thoughts on that, but I don't think I can only offer maybe a simpler answer to that, because if I were to try and provide a more detailed explanation of it, I might just completely go around in a circle and not make any sense. So I'll just say this. I think the reason why is because, well, it's the same reason that I think that you and I and a lot of other people are interested in these esoteric traditions. It's because there's a religious instinct within human beings. And when they find that that instinct isn't going, it isn't addressed in the most adequate way by mainstream religious institutions, some people will be instinctually driven to look to other traditions, be it religious, philosophical, whatever, to try and fulfill that need. And so, maybe because of the impenetrability, the mystery of the esoteric traditions, people are drawn to that. And also because, they're mainstream people who gave it some legitimacy from a psychological perspective, like Jung, that people go and seek it out. And I think
Yeah.
that's especially true in the modern era, after the effects of the Enlightenment and the death of God, the Nietzschean death of God, have wrought their effects over the last 300 years. People are slipping into nihilism, and they don't know if they can contend with a nihilistic world, and so they try to look for a spiritual route.
Yeah.
That's the best way I can answer that question.
Yeah, no, I think that totally makes sense. And there's this impulse in myself that I've tried to do a little bit of dissection on. And to tie this back in with what we're talking about, I mean the impulse to seed, like use certain images and explore certain images even though you're not aware of the context or even like the meaning. Like let's just stick with the tree of like Kabbalic tree of life for
Sure,
whatever
sure.
reason. I can't tell you the first time I ever saw that image, but I remember thinking, "Oh, this is interesting." And just being kind of drawn to it. And I think to that impulse that I'm describing of being drawn to something and somehow also wanting to perpetuate something even though I don't know what it means or what context it fits into. I think there's a part of you that does know, and it's almost like this asynchronous understanding process by like again, this gets into acausal connecting principles and ways of knowing that are not simple Aristotelian. I went out there, I measured it, I captured it, I empirically, did all of these different manipulations to it, therefore I understand. This is more of like a Platonic anamnesis.
Yes.
Again, realm of forms, like you alluded to kind of jokingly before we were recording. Like, I know this is something, and I don't know what it is right now, but I know it's important. And it's almost like a weird... It's like
It's
a
an
node.
intuition.
Yeah, it's an intuition. It's a node in the it's an angular node in the process of the Ouroboros eating its own tail. It's like you don't need to know why you need to go this direction. You just need to go this direction, and eventually it's going to make sense to you. And it's kind of something like that, I think.
Yes.
For a lot of people.
I think, yeah, that's another lovely way of putting it.
And another way that's actually spookier is Jung did talk about the idea of archetypal possession, and that some people at various times could become archetypally possessed. And the reason I'm bringing that up here is because what if there are certain archetypes that need to make their presence known through those kind of portals, and they just kind of like whisper to you enough so that you're like, I don't know why, but I want to put a biblically accurate angel in my meme today, or something. Like I did that yesterday, for instance. Like,
Okay.
It could be something like that, because I can't tell you where the urge to do that came from. It's like, I like this idea right now. And though I don't even fully know why I'm choosing this image, I'm choosing it and I'm putting it out to my audience. And if you think about that in terms of some of the like more popular esoterically dipped media out there, that's interesting.
Sorry. Is there something there that you want me to address?
Well, that idea of perhaps being driven by archetypes, I think is a
Sure.
really interesting idea that not a lot of people think too much about, or even probably think is possible or consequential. But I think the deeper you go into doing any kind of inner work and asking questions about, what is this dream image? What is this dream image representing? Where is it coming from? What does it want? What is it trying to communicate? The more you start to realize that whether you're aware of it or not, there are signals coming, and you can sort of begin to, a little bit at least, suss out the source of those signals, I think.
Yeah, I think it's reasonable to believe in stuff like that. Like Jung said, do people believe in ideas, or do ideas... Sorry, no. Do people have ideas, or do ideas have people?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I love that.
Gets at that same underlying idea. And those ideas manifest within, but they can also manifest without, and they can guide us towards higher states of being. That's the theory.
Right. And you know, so in the Jungian sense, we were talking about alchemy and this transformation of going from one sublimation, prima materia, to rubedo. For you, does that bleed into a realm that can only be called spirituality, or does it stay psychological in a more scientific sense for you? Or where does that, you know, because if we're talking psychological in the Jungian sense, it's like, for me, it is fundamentally a spiritual conversation. But, you know, in the modern sense of like it just being, you know, psychology being the scientific and study of the mind, and not bleeding into these areas that we're discussing at all today, really, other than probably to diagnose someone with something. But for you, is that process, that overarching process of alchemical transformation of the psyche, does that go to the level of spirituality for you? And if so, like, what does that mean for you?
Okay, here's my honest answer, and this is me being 100% honest to everybody that's listening right now. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I suppose my interest in it, there's something to be said about that. If there's spiritual validity to it, it's hard to say. I suppose I find when I study alchemy and the psychological interpretation of it, and when I see the various weird happenings that happen within and around me in the form of synchronicities, I suppose not being able to explain that, but also being interested in it enough to want to pursue it. I don't know. Make of that what you will.
Yeah.
That, you know, I ask myself that question as if somebody else is asking it to me on a regular basis. And I just keep saying the same thing. I don't know.
I'm 100% with you on not knowing, and feeling like I'm at varying degrees of like perhaps tumbling into something pathological. But
yeah. That's the thing. You have to constantly straddle that line, and I suppose there's some excitement in doing that, but there's also great danger, because if you fall too greatly over into the realm of dogma and believing something overzealously, you can corrupt, you know, any potential legitimacy that the process had in the first place. So,
yeah.
And by saying whether I believe or don't believe, even just doing that could mess things up. So I don't know.
Yeah, I don't like the word believe either. Like when people ask me, do you believe in, I'm like, I don't really like that term. I mean, I'll say what I gravitate toward, and based on the information I've collected in my own personal experiences and etc., this is what I gravitate toward. This is what I think, or this is where my intuition is leading me, whatever you want to call it. And for me, my intuition does eventually bring me into what I think is the sort of perennial philosophy spiritual blooming, the golden chain of thinkers that you can sort of trace back into antiquity, and of which I think Jung was absolutely a part of that chain. And I think he did more than anyone else to modernize and
Oh, sure.
make that
Yeah.
information relevant than almost anyone in his day. But for me, it goes back to, if you want to, understand the real underlying archetype and point of alchemy, read the Corpus Hermeticum. It'll tell
Yeah.
you. It will tell you. Like that. I think it's like one of the very beginning, that what's usually called the Poimandres, where Hermes is talking to the demiurgic spirit, like the spirit of God, and he's having this vision. And by the way, this is not the bad demiurge. This is just like
Right.
the demiurge who created the world and such. He'll tell you. It's like you. This is how it was all created. This is what you are. This is what a human is. This is what your soul is. Oh, and by the way, we didn't talk about this, but before human beings were split into genders, in terms of Hermetic metaphysics and Platonic metaphysics, human beings at some point are far-reaching spiritual ancestors, according to these allegories, were both male and female, and then we were later on split apart. And total kind of an aside, I was thinking, in the Jungian sense of males having a female soul or an anima and vice versa. What if that's some kind of like metaphysical
Return to that.
Yeah, it's like, but not only that, but it's like a vestigial metaphysical limb. Like we still have that in us psychically and spiritually, but we don't have it physically anymore. And that's part of the imperative to reunite or climb back up the sort of spiritual ladder, is to reconnect with that lost part of yourself. And once you've reconnected with that lost part of yourself, you can sort of be admitted into, the symbolism starts to get a little new agey and wooey, but as soon as you start talking about higher dimensions of consciousness and stuff, I start to want to get really careful with my words. But anyway, that essentially seems to be the process. Is like, this is the process by which you go from ignorant, consuming human being that only exists in one dimension of reality, to reuniting with the unspeakable mystery, non-dual source, God, underlying one, whatever you want to call it. And it seems like that's what, as grandiose as that sounds, like that's what the nugget at the core of alchemy is, maybe.
Yes, I completely agree, and that's one of the things that compels my interest in alchemy so much, is that image, particularly of the union of the masculine and feminine into one. And it's not just something that's within the Hermetic traditions. It's something that the process of reunifying with that original state, or with somebody who embodies that original state of this perfect union, this one, is something that goes not just within the Gnostic traditions, be it the Christian Gnostics or the Kabbalists, but also religions that were mainstream at what time in history. Like there's Zurvan. He was the primordial man. I believe he was androgynous within Zoroastrianism.
Oh, right.
Yeah. Who else? But yeah, there's like the monad from Gnosticism. There's Adam Kadmon. He was also androgynous within the Kabbalah. And there's a couple of other ones that I can't remember off the top of my head. But it's just this constant image that shows up everywhere. Are they describing something like a psychological pattern, something that you have to do? Well, Jung thought so. Is it true? Well, again, I don't know. But as you just laid out, and I also try to do, is I just try to see where the path leads me.
Yeah. The first like red pill, I think, to make this a little bit less, woo woo, is to ask yourself, does my inner world matter? Do my dreams matter? Are they, whatever they are, trying to communicate something to me? and if you don't know or you're ambivalent on that question, I would suggest reading a book like Inner Work by Robert Johnson, the Jungian analyst, because he really starts very practically. There's no esoteric language. There's no, you know, there is archetypal language, and he eventually kind of relates it back to some ancient ways of thinking and spiritual traditions, and maybe he mentions alchemy, but it's in passing. But it's the sort of royal road, I think, to understanding that what we call the imagination, quote unquote, is not something to be dismissed as fantasy. It's actually in and of itself. I mean, I guess I'm giving you the answer of whether or not your internal world matters, but I think there's this sense that it only matters if somehow that world I can magically use it to influence the outer world. And I think that's the wrong way to think about it. And I think this is one of the main points that probably Jung was trying to get at too, is like, this inner world matters in and of itself. And the more you can come into contact with this inner world, the more everything is going to make sense to you. The more like you're going to find balances and reassurances and subjective strength that doesn't even necessarily have like a physical yield, but it has a psycho spiritual like well-being kind of a yield that's difficult to speak to in modern language, but it's subjectively very relevant and something that you feel on a daily basis.
Yeah, to that I would say probably, yeah, it certainly can have a positive benefit, just as long as you don't fall into the realm of overzealous dogma.
Yeah.
But I think there are a lot of people like you and I are capable of not letting that happen. So sure.
Yeah. So you briefly alluded to, before we were recording, this, or I guess it was me that was sort of drawing this comparison of, making content about this stuff, researching this stuff versus feeling like you're making some level of personal progress. Like you're having some kind of, you're having personal realizations, you're doing the work, so to speak. Do you talk at all about what that means for you, or how you actually do that work, or what some of your practices are?
No, not publicly. That's actually like sort of a very personal question that like I don't even think I can answer. I just, the reason why I talk about it, I suppose, is just because I like pointing out to people that there are other people who have been influenced by this and show the secret messages that they leave in their work. And I then sort of leave people to ponder whether or not there is something there that the people who leave those messages actually believe in. And then by trying to pursue an answer to that question, they might find themselves on their own alchemical journey. That's sort of why I do that. As for actual personal practices, again, that's something that I'm sorry to be so obtuse and like closed off, but like I would provide an answer if I could, but I don't know how.
Yeah, no, I get that. I get that. I completely get it. Again, if people are interested in how they could, start doing some of this work in a way where it's not just going to be so foreign and so cloaked in esotericism, again, that book Inner Work is such a good resource, because it will get you looking at dreams, looking at imagination, looking at active imagination in a way that is approachable, and it's not, overly esoteric. And it's like, it's the beginnings of bringing ritual back into your life non-dogmatically, and learning this language that this whole conversation is sort of hovering around, of this language of symbol and this language of archetype. But it is intimidating, man, to approach these things, because, you and I know, I'm not trying to act like I'm some sort of master of mythology and symbol. I'm really not. And but on the same token, I know that I know more than the average person, and I don't feel like I'm very fluent in this language that's trying to communicate, through the unconscious, through dreams, through imagination, through these
Yeah.
strange little internal desires to, perpetuate images, for instance. So it is
But
like,
you want
mhm.
to make sure that people who are reaching out to you, that you want to convince them that you're doing right by them, and you want to convince yourself that you're doing right by them, and you want to make sure that anybody else that might be on the outside looking in, trying to criticize you, that you don't draw ill intention from people that are misunderstanding you.
Yeah, I
Right?
hope not. Yeah, I hope
No,
not. And I hope
I
I
don't
don't
think you
never,
are.
and I hope I don't come across like I'm an authority on anything. Like I really, I come, I guess I technically come from a journalistic background just because I went to school for that. So that's kind of how I approach information in terms of, you vet something, you research something, you report something back. And that's one impulse. I do definitely have a shared impulse with you of thinking something is important and leaving it there for people to experiment with and dig further on their
Yes.
own, because
Yeah.
I think that's the only source of real wisdom, is going at it yourself, seeing how planting those seeds in your own psyche works on you in the long term, and where those things start to steer you. Like that's the only way that this more esoteric and even psychological stuff works. There's no times tables, there's no memorize this and then you'll be good. It's so much more strange and subtle.
Hmm.
Um, what's been really piquing your interest lately in terms of Jung and this more esoteric stuff? If you can, if you
Hmm.
can even peel yourself away from Alan Wake 2 to even think about such things, as I'm sure.
Right. Well, actually, you know what? I've been a good boy the last 48 hours. I've been playing a lot of Alan Wake 2, but I've actually been trying to uh, create a backup plan so that way, I have a video that I could put out this coming week. And now that you mention it, it is actually something that's related to Jung and the way that his psychoanalytic theories regarding religious symbolism might apply to The Legend of Zelda.
Ooh,
Yeah.
yeah,
So
yeah.
did you by chance ever see a video that I put out called The Psychology of the Trinity?
I think I did. I think I
Mhm.
did, but I think it was a while ago.
Okay. So to summarize, Jung, well, in that video, I analyzed two essays. One was by Jung and another was by one of his students that a lot of people tend to read alongside Jung, a gentleman by the name of Edward Edinger.
Oh yeah,
He's a guy that kind of condenses Jung's theories into more accessible language. And the subject of those two essays was trying to determine why it was that the number three so often is associated with the highest deities in world religions. So there's obviously Christian Trinity, but there's also the Hindu Trimurti and Tridevi, the Buddhist Trikaya, the Kabbalist Supernal Triad, the various Egyptian and Babylonian trinities like Anu, El, and Bel, I think their names are. I might get that wrong.
mm.
But yeah, there's tons of them. So what Jung and Edinger were trying to determine is why that is. So well, Jung and Edinger both looked into the history of speculation regarding the meaning of numbers. And one person that they cite is Pythagoras.
Yeah,
He believed that the idea of oneness, this idea of perfect unity, the most holy goal, I suppose, of any religion, is something that you describe by the number three. So, what is unity? It's one opposite being melded with another opposite, and those two opposites being united by a third force, right? So, it's one, but it's also
yeah.
three, right? Now,
Hmm.
what is interesting is Plato. He was heavily influenced by Pythagoras when it came
Yes.
to the creation of his metaphysical ideas. And one thing that he noticed that he had a lot of trouble with is when he tried to take Pythagoras' idea regarding the meaning of one and three and apply it to his theory of forms. So Plato believed that there was this space. I suppose you can sort of liken it to the Gnostic pleroma, or Jung's world of archetypes, uh, where he envisioned that Pythagoras' idea of perfect unity would exist. So 1 plus 2 united by a third force. He tried to replicate that idea. He tried to speculate as to whether or not that idea could take on a form in material space. So, for example, if there's an idea of a chair, there's a
Mm-hmm.
varying forms that a chair can take in the material world. Well, what about Pythagoras' idea of perfect unity, of oneness? Well, when you try to replicate that idea in three-dimensional space, it requires height, width, and depth. In the idea space, the idea of unity is just 2 points united by a third force. But when you try to replicate that in the material world, you need more than one mean, which necessarily corrupts the original idea of unity. Does Before I move into Zelda, I just got to ask, does any of that make sense? And please be honest.
Bro, it absolutely does, because I've been going, like, over the last 6 months, I've gone so deep down the Platonic rabbit hole. So
Mm-hmm.
everything you're talking about in terms of like Platonic metaphysics, his relationship to Pythagoreanism, and the fact that he was probably an initiate of Pythagoreanism himself. Yes, I'm on board. Yes, I'm on
Okay.
board. And I have so
Okay.
many things I want to add too, but I want you to please
Okay.
continue. Yeah.
So, and then, sorry, one last thing before we get into Zelda. Jung and Edinger noticed that this problem of this fourth element that cannot reconcile with the one, with the three, the one as three, and vice versa, is a pattern that shows up everywhere in religious thinking. And then I go on to like give a variety of examples in that video, and then I show how that very same idea applies in a lot of different ways to the Legend of Zelda's lore and the Triforce. So I don't want to spoil too much, but
Mm.
I'll just give you an example. So you know the symbol of the Triforce, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, there's
It's
this
like,
theory
yeah.
in the Legend of Zelda community that has been around forever that there is a missing piece from the Triforce. That it's not a Triforce, it's a Tetraforce.
Hmm.
And I go on to show why that theory isn't completely crazy. So, how do I explain this? So, in the Legend of Zelda lore, there's this creation story where the three goddesses, Din, Furor, and Nehru, descend from the sacred realm, which is not unlike Plato's realm of ideas or the Gnostic pleroma, down into the chaos below and make the world out of nothing. The argument that I'm trying to make here is that it'll make sense when I put out the video, but the idea is that there's the three goddesses, and then there is this chaos god in the form of potentially Demise or Ganondorf that exists below, that the three golden goddesses were trying to operate on top of to Ganondorf's chagrin, and then there's this constant interplay that the fourth element can't reconcile with the three.
Mm-hmm,
Now, I
mm-hmm.
know that sounds crazy. Trust me, I know, but there's a whole bunch more evidence that I'm going to present. I just can't present it off the top of my head in a coherent way. I have to write it down. That's why I write all my scripts.
Oh
Because
yeah,
if
yeah.
I didn't, But
No, same.
I
And
could go into I can go into greater detail when we're done if you're intrigued by what I'm trying to suggest to you.
oh yeah, I very much am, and it totally makes sense. There's nothing about it that seemed too strange or far fetched to me, and it makes sense that they would be. This is where they'd be pulling from the more esoteric, metaphysical creation myths that run throughout the world. Because what I was talking about before, this like golden thread. If you go back as far as these creation myths go, particularly in the West, with people like Plato. If you read Plato's Timaeus and you read his account of creation, and you read the Hermetic account of creation in the Poimandres, and you read the Genesis account of creation, it's so similar. Like these concepts are so similar. And yeah, the apple falls from the tree and there are some important different hypostases proposed, like, were they making it from nothing, or were they making it from, this noetic tool set kind of thing, or like the tool set provided in the realm of forms, essentially, as part of kind of the Platonic creation myth. Like the demiurge is tapped into the realm of forms. The demiurge is using the logos from the realm of forms and the nous from the realm of forms to create the rules down here, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
So I just got to say one other thing, because you brought up Plato's Timaeus.
Yeah.
The problem before also appears in that book. So what does the demiurge do to create the world? He separates he unites. It's something to do with the divisible and the indivisible. Does that ring a bell?
Yeah. There's a lot of speculation that this is alchemical, like the whole creation of the cosmos, because it's talking about the primordial elements. It's talking about correspondences between like human souls and stars. It's talking about putting all the different elements in these almost like cauldron like, things to create souls. And I don't know if I'm hitting on exactly what you're reaching for it, but
so I don't think so, unfortunately. But so it's either the quote that Jung makes and that Edinger makes in their respective essays from Plato's Timaeus is that when the demiurge created the world, I think it was he tried to create a union of the divisible and the indivisible, and that was
that makes sense.
Yeah,
okay,
and that was Plato's perspective on it. But then, in doing so, he encountered a problem with the fourth. He said that he united them into a place where they were the same, but they were also different.
Right. And man, this is an amazing full circle that we're doing here, because this is a yet another example of like a squaring the circle kind of problem. This is like you're trying, like the indivisible. What would that be? That would be like the perfect, the one, the timeless, and then trying to differentiate that. There's a paradox there. How do you differentiate the perfect and the one into multiple forms? And now you're starting to get into I think some of the more mature approaches to what we call the problem of evil. It's like the more you alter and diversify and change, the more, like, yes, you're imbuing it with uniqueness, but you're also imbuing it with a level of corruption or distance from the purity, right? And now we're getting into some like really abstract metaphysical territory. But I like to think about this kind of stuff. So for me, it's not that weird. But I think that is, the conventional historical knowledge of how far back alchemy goes. No real scholar says that Plato was an alchemist or these people earlier on were alchemists. But I think for all intents and purposes, they clearly were. It's just that they didn't use that word. But they were absolutely concerned with that fundamental alchemical equation that we were talking about earlier, which is, how do I go from being just a guy who feels cut off from purpose and God and spirituality to merging back with that and realizing that I'm carrying that logos, that nous, that's the same as that pure thing.
It's the Hermetic tradition. It's what's hidden. Yeah. It's intuition. Yeah.
Exactly.
Boom.
Yeah.
Got that around full circle.
Yes, we did. Yes, we did. And I know you got to get going, so we can wrap it up. I do want to tell you that synchronicity real quick, if you have 1 minute.
Okay, please.
So I watched. We didn't, again, perfect correspondence to last time. We didn't talk at all about Ion, but I watched like probably 10 of your Ion videos. And,
oh God. Okay.
So I watched like 10 of those videos, and then this morning I was listening to a clip, just one of the very few clips on YouTube of Zosimus, his writings, and he's talking about a vision of a priest doing some kind of sacrifice on a bull-like altar. And again, this is one of these very strange visionary things. It sounds like active imagination out of the Red Book or a mushroom trip or something. And Guess what the fucking priest introduces himself as? Like what his name is?
But what?
Ion. He says his name is Ion. And I just was like, what? What? How? Yeah.
Do you remember, just out of curiosity, do you remember what the last video in that series, in my series that I did, was that you watched? What chapter?
I'm gonna guess it's
Was it
probably
the one
nine
on
or
Nostradamus?
yeah, I did watch that one, yes.
Okay. Uh, yeah, there's a lot more in terms of synchronicities and weird stuff like that that after you've told me that, you're gonna want to watch that until the end of the series, because I think I actually do talk about Zosimos at some point, and also about the word ion as a name that are going to intrigue you. Let's just say that.
I for sure will. I will for sure, man. Well, hey, it's been great rapping with you, man. I could
Yeah,
talk to you
always
all
a
day.
pleasure. Yeah, let's talk about ion more next time. That's
Yeah.
a huge rabbit hole to
Oh
go
yeah,
down.
yeah. Let's do it, and I'll have to get more steeped in it so I can actually intelligently, uh, you know, match wits with you on that one.
Sure.
All right, my friend. Thank you.
Thank you for your time, man. Always a pleasure.